And I remember being absolutely awe-inspired by it. Most of the ice you see in these pictures may well be gone in 40 or 50 years' time. Fridtjof Nansen, this is the guy I told you about earlier, or rather I alluded to him earlier. Dave and I, my friend Dave, decided to sort of to copy his or follow in his footsteps and make his first British crossing of Greenland following Nansen's footsteps, and it was an absolutely wonderful thing. It's the time I told you about where I got a bit hungry and was going to eat fish on the beach and all that sort of thing. So this man was a doctor as well as being an explorer in the true sense of the word. He did an awful lot for repatriating Russian refugees after the First World War. He was a humanitarian as well as an explorer and a doctor. Wonderful, incredible man. That was a picture from his book. And that shows a little mountain called Keatak Mountain on the east coast of Greenland. And Dave and I had studied his book before we went, and we kind of imprinted these memories of these little areas in Greenland. And when we arrived, it was very emotional to actually see that mountain and kick off on the journey. And that's our tent there. And we headed off across the ice. It took us, as I say, about 2 months. Every morning I'd get up and clean the tent. That was pretty much the view I'd have of the tent every morning. Dave was what we call the inside man, and I was the outside man. So my job was to get up, usually about -28. That was actually not desperately cold for the Arctic, I have to tell you. And you clean all the snow off the tent, get the sledges ready to go again and everything else. The Greenland ice cap is the most amazing place. It looks a bit like a desert, but it was an absolutely astounding spiritual experience to cross it. I just can't explain it. Sadly, I won't be going back to do anything like that again because I can't face the idea of flying when I'm telling everyone else or suggesting to everyone else politely they don't. But it was a wonderful experience, I must say. But on a more sort of sobering note, recently I was talking to a friend of mine, a chap called Bill Mockridge, who lives just down the road from me in Wales. He's a scientist, and unlike me, I'm a sort of tree surgeon and a few GCSE O levels, and that's it. He's a very, very technical, highly qualified scientist. He's worked for BAS, and he's currently come back from a spell in the Arctic, working on the Greenland ice cap, looking at all these melt balls that are happening on the Greenland ice cap. And he was chatting away, pouring a cup of coffee for me, and we were talking about all sorts of things. Then we got onto the subject of Greenland and the ice and everything else. And he said, I just can't believe how fast that ice cap is melting at the moment, because he's actually working with these pools. And you've probably heard, all of you, how they're going down into the ice and almost lubricating the glaciers. So whereas the glaciers were jammed, now they've got this lubricant underneath and they're going even faster. So I said, well, the Greenland ice cap melts, that means that the sea level's going to rise, that's going to be a real problem, isn't it? He said, well, yeah, it is, in this one matter-of-fact way that scientists talk. He said, well, it is a problem. He said, people move away from the coast. So he said, that's not the real problem. So, well, what is the real problem? He said, well, the real problem will be when all that fresh water cascades into the ocean and stops the Atlantic conveyor. And I said, well, why is that a problem? He said, well, in the first year of that happening, 50% of the UK will die. And I thought, well, that sounds a bit dramatic. But he was absolutely, he worked with this stuff. He kind of knows in a scientific way the cause and effect. And I thought to myself about that. And later I read an article in a newspaper that told me that last winter, although it was one of the warmest winters on record, apparently, about 23,000 people died of cold. Now, that was probably one of the warmest winters on record. I then went on to read that the reason they died of cold was most of them were old and most of them couldn't afford their heating. So you start to scratch a bit deeper, and you start to see a few more reasons for this. And so then, when he tells me that 50% of the UK will be dead, if that happened, you're talking about plunging the UK into Siberian weather, where ice blizzards would just rip down power lines. And recently, this year, there was Lincolnshire or somewhere, there's about 4 or 5, or how many people without electricity. If you rely as an old person on electricity for your heating, you've got a few weeks of it having no heating, you probably would die, quite frankly, and you couldn't move outside your house. But this Siberian stuff will be massively worse than that, massively worse. My feelings have changed over the last year an awful lot. now I tend to look at everything I see and always come down to one bottom line problem, regardless. It's a problem that when you talk to people, as I do quite often, this is the first time I've addressed a group of people like this. It's usually schools or WIs or universities or mountaineering clubs and that sort of thing. The problem I come across is a kind of reluctance to engage with the real problem. And that is really, I think, because most people have what's known as a comfort zone. And they perceive a new future, if you like, or a change in future as being an erosion of their comfort zone. They think it's going to be something uncomfortable, unpleasant, hair shirt, back to living in yurts, whatever they think. But my view of this, personally, is that I think there is only one answer to me. It always comes down to what I said at the beginning when I started talking to you, that this idea of an economy is more important than the planet. It isn't, quite frankly. And I think that I'm not sure I understand everything that the socialist movement talks about, and I'm sure, in fact I know, a lot of you here are way more informed than I am on that matter. But what I'm utterly convinced about is our present system has reached the end of its safe, useful life. And I think a change has to happen. It has to be a worldwide change, and it has to be the end of the system that we currently think is the only.
I would like to thank Glenn Morris on behalf of the Socialist Party on providing such an excellent presentation. Brian is now going to continue with his presentation. What he's got lined up for us, I've got no idea whatsoever, other than I know that it will be the Socialist Party's position in regards to society in general, and particularly with the subject matter that we're looking at this afternoon, and that is climate change. While Brian is setting up his equipment, I'm going to pass around the mail-in meeting list for those people that haven't already got their names down. Thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot, Brian. I suppose my first thought is, how do I follow that? The last presentation I enjoyed immensely, Glenn. Trekking across icy wastes, encounters with grizzly bears, eating rotten fish. I just feel I'm going to disappoint my comparison in that last presentation. However, I was thinking while Glenn was speaking, I came down from Glasgow last night on the sleeper, and there was a few Dungeons Glaswegians there, a few bear encounters there, maybe not grizzlies. And I did eat from the train buffet, and I think it was probably rotten fish that I had. And we were looking for scenes of desolation then to this 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning at Euston Station takes the biscuit. But that's my attempt to sort of try and compete, as it were, with a hugely impressive presentation, as far as I was concerned. Very useful from my point of view. There's a lot of things that Glenn said there that I'm going to tie in with. I'd like to say it because we worked very closely together and had a lot of communication on the two talks. It didn't, I think it's more just by happy accident. There's a lot of very interesting things that Glenn's raised the question on, and I'm going to hopefully elaborate on over the next 40 minutes or so. So, here's what I'm going to touch on. First of all, how does capitalism account for the environment? I hope some of you at the back all of you at the back can read this font size. How does capitalism account for the environment? What can we do about it? First of all, as individuals, there's a lot of emphasis when people talk about climate change and global warming, there's a lot of emphasis on what you do as consumers. Again, Glenn touched on this. Is that really enough? We would say no. And then look at, well, what is capitalism suggesting can be done to deal with this immense social problem, global warming and climate change? What are the options that they are saying are sensible and practicable. And then we'll come to look, of course, at the socialist alternative and what sort of response socialists can say to those to the problem of climate change. As we're all aware, there have been countless reports and documents in the last few years ramping up the evidence that global warming is happening and expanding the range of impacts that global warming appears to be having across the globe. And Glenn's touched on a number relating to the Arctic. Just to summarise some of these ones that jump out. Most of the figures that I've taken here are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. It's itself a very, very interesting body, and one of the things that, if we have time, I would like to explore, contrast how on the one hand, society's got itself into this mess where we are slowly cooking ourselves, and we've got ourselves in this position where we may be facing mass extinctions of species to an extent not seen since the dinosaurs roamed the planet. But to contrast that situation and the causes of that with, on the other hand, the immensely impressive efforts of humanity, or sections of humanity, to try and get a handle on the problem. And I'm talking about the scientific community. And this really is a lifeline in many ways that science has, over a very, very short period of time, managed to take the hypothesis that global warming, this theory of the greenhouse effect, take that hypothesis and test it and see that yes, it is actually happening. And more than that, scientists over the last few decades have fleshed that out, put some meat onto that, and have started to give a handle, get a handle on the range of impacts that this may have on humanity and on the planet as a whole. And finally, in the last few years, starting to get some handle on what sort of technical solutions will be necessary to mitigate and slow down global warming. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's interesting to note that the chairman of that panel, he wrote fairly recently, he was just commenting on how this tremendous cooperative effort between thousands of scientists across hundreds and hundreds of different disciplines, scientific disciplines. Because of course at one time global warming was an issue for environmental scientists and atmospheric chemists, but now we know it's an issue for oceanographers and meteorologists and geophysicists, because the problem is spreading out and affecting the whole of the environment. And that's demanded an interdisciplinary approach, a coordinated approach. And what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is doing is pulling together, and it does it fairly naturally, because this is what science does. It's transparent, it's coordinated, it's not centralised particularly. And the interesting point that this chairman made was that, to all intents and purposes, this massive human endeavour to try and get a handle on this massive social problem, this massive human endeavour has occurred, and with most people involved in it not taking a single penny for doing it. Sure, they're salaried scientists and they like status and they like kudos and they like research grants and all the rest of it, but by and large their involvement on this panel is something that they're giving voluntarily. And if you think that this is probably the greatest scientific endeavour that humanity has ever embarked on, or been forced to embark on, thank goodness it's not in the hands of private industry. How much would they be charging for this sort of information that they'd be using to save the planet? So, what sort of statistics are coming out from the scientists? I'm just going to pick out a few of these. In Africa by 2020, 75 to 250 million people may be exposed to water stress. That's quite a broad figure there. I think one of the big worrying things is just how many unknowns there are in all this. I don't want to get too Donald Rumsfeldish about this, but there's known unknowns, and the worst thing is there's the unknown unknowns. We just don't know what we don't know. Again, by 2020 in Africa, agricultural production and access to food projected to be severely compromised. Now, I might come back to that because obviously at the moment it could be argued that it's pretty severely compromised anyway. In Asia, changes in the hydrological cycle, so it's a different mechanism leading to endemic morbidity and mortality. Just picking up a few points here. And in Europe, reduced winter tourism. No black runs on Val d'Isère. So this is getting serious, isn't it? Again, some of these cartoons and captions, you may not be able to see it at the back now. I apologise. But of all the reports on projected floods and heat waves and devastation and so on, these don't seem to be enough, really. These things don't actually register on the balance sheet of current society. What the Daily Mail needs to know, of course, is how much our insurance premiums going to actually rise by. So to answer this question, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, commissioned an economist called Sir Nicholas Stern to write a report called the Stern Report, to put it into language that capitalism could understand, basically put a pound sign in front of the figures. So how did he do this? How did capitalism try and quantify the costs of climate change? Well, one way that's commonly used is to use the price that an individual person would insure their own life for. But the problem with this is, when you put that rubbish into the model, what comes out is rubbish. What it basically tells you is that the poorer you are, the cheaper your life. And we kind of knew this anyway inside the market society, but it's just interesting to have it laid absolutely bare. This approach winds up concluding that the average US citizen is worth the same as 100 Bangladeshis, who, of course, don't take out much life insurance. Stern, and how appropriate is that name, took this logic one step further, in fact. In his report, he explicitly costed the impact of climate change by a fairly unusual method, I would suggest. By adding up how much consumption globally was going to be reduced. Reduced because all those pesky people who are going to be flooded or displaced or are going to fall ill, and because of that are going to be consuming less and less. And that is the real tragedy from capitalism's point of view, of course, from the perspective of the market system. That somebody who's just been flooded is probably not going to be too interested in the enhanced viewing experience of a high definition TV. Somebody who is suffering malaria may not be that interested in a 2-for-1 sofa offer during the winter sales or whatever. The adverts tell us because you're worth it when they're trying to sell us something that we probably don't need, but sadly some people seem to be worth more than others. And as if that's not bad enough, the worst slap in the face for capitalism, of course, is that dead people, those drowned in the storms resulting from climate change, for example, what about them? Well, of course, they don't even consume anything. And this is actually what Sir Nicholas Stern calculated. This high-fluting economist worked out the drop in consumption. The alarming news that he communicated to global policymakers then was that unchallenged, climate change may lead to a drop in consumption of anything between 5 and 20% of gross domestic product. So it isn't just, as the slide shows, death, pestilence, starvation. There's the possibility of some financial implications as well, and that's what worries capitalism. Now this logic seems to me to be the insane logic of the tobacco industry, writ large, taken up with gusto by capitalism as a whole. You'll all be well aware that the tobacco industry has a problem in that its product kills its customers. Now that's bad enough in itself, of course, but the real impact this has is on future sales. Dead men don't smoke tabs. Similarly, with production in capitalism as a whole, you have a similar process. Carbon dioxide emissions are caused, in the main part at least, by increased industrial production, and distribution over the last 30 years. It's not an individual's lungs that's getting contaminated as with tobacco smoke, it's the planet's lungs, as it were. But this increased production that's been ramping up over the last few decades looks like it may just kill off a not insignificant proportion of humanity. And the real tragedy of this for capitalism, of course, is that there may not be enough customers left to actually buy their products. And the irony of, on one hand, bemoaning the potential drop in GDP, when it's the GDP increases that have probably been causing the problem of global warming, that irony seems to have been lost on Sir Nicholas Stern. Now, one of the main headlines that his report generated when it was published a couple of years back was his assertion, and it's a bold one from an economist, that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. Now, if I have time, or during the discussion period, we might be able to return to this. It's not a competition, of course, but if the market system is in the dock, if we are taking other offences into account, if there is a charge sheet against capitalism, then there's a few other social problems that I would probably want to have taken into account as examples of market failure, which are at least the equal of climate change. And Glenn actually mentioned them. You can't see these as separate issues to be treated one after the other. Climate change, global poverty, war. These are all interlinked. So if we have time, I'll try and come back and link some of these things together. Nevertheless, there's certainly no denying that the view of the atmosphere as a bottomless dumping ground for carbon dioxide is an example of the market externalising a cost, not putting it on its balance sheet, out of sight and out of mind. And that's what Stern was referring to when he talks about market failure. Now, at least Sir Nicholas Stern had the good grace to admit that his approach, his methodology, raises, quote, profound difficulties, but he still used that method anyway. And I think the reason he used it is that that's the best he's got. That's the best that capitalism's got. That's the best it can do to try and get a handle on how to solve this problem. And many people are shocked by that, disgusted. That's immoral. How can you put a price on human life? That's just terrible. But from my point of view, from a moral socialist point of view, that is actually what goes on day after day inside capitalism. With every commodity, whether it's essential to life or not, food and water and shelter and healthcare, a price is put on it, and further down the line, ultimately a price tag is put on human life. This isn't immoral, it's just the way this particular system operates. So what can the individual do in response to this? And as I said earlier, a lot of the discussion about this has been, should you take cheap air flights? There's a choice with air flights. I'd rather take a cheap one than an expensive one. I don't think expensive air flights are actually worse than cheap ones, but should you turn the thermostat down a degree, as this person is doing here? There's been an awful emphasis on action as an individual, as a consumer. So I'll touch on this first of all. I've got a lot of problems, and the Socialist Party has a lot of problems with consumer politics. The main problem is with people expressing their views through their consumption choices, voting through your wallet or your purse. The main problem with that, of course, is that some people have more votes than others, and some people have more money than others. One person, one vote seems to me a fairly reasonable principle. People have fought and died for that over the years, and we should really try and stick to that. The right to choose between two brands of washing powder really doesn't strike me as being something worth dying for. So to start giving credence to consumer politics, without at least engaging socially and politically, to see the problem in terms of competing choices on the supermarket shelves seems to me to be a backward step. We are Homo sapiens after all. We're not Homo economicus. We're not just a belly on legs. We're not just a mouth We have a brain, we can think abstractly, we can solve problems. It's a backward step just to view ourselves as consumers, nothing else. A dismal, redundant view of humanity. I'm not going to bore you with the details of why some people have more money than others. In fact, Glenn touched on this a little bit as well, the massive disparity in the distribution of wealth throughout the planet. We cannot ignore that when we come to talk about an issue such as climate change. So I'm not going to bore you with statistics on that, but I'll just give you a wee anecdote that I read the other day about this man. It's the only picture I could get on the internet. Jack Nicholson, an actor. And it's just trying to show the sort of disparity in wealth that some people have. Now, Jack Nicholson was sailing down to Monaco in his yacht to go to the Monaco Grand Prix. I'm sure you've all done similar yourselves. But you berthed at the marina, apparently, where the cars go past, for a split second. That was it. So he was sailing down to Monaco. The problem from Jack Nicholson's point of view is that all his friends on the yacht were wanting to see the Monaco Grand Prix, but he, and I have some sympathy with him on this, he doesn't like Grand Prix racing. Instead, he wanted to watch his favourite basketball team, the LA Lakers, playing in a basketball match. To his surprise, French television wasn't showing the LA Lakers playing. So he had this big quandary, how is he going to see this basketball match? So he phoned around, or probably got a flunky to phone around for him, and time was running short, and the match was going to start in an hour, and they finally got hold of the BBC, and they said, well, we can help you out, and what they were able to do for him was to take a satellite that was in orbit and reposition the satellite so they could take the signals from the LA Lakers game in Los Angeles and beam it down to one man in front of his TV in Monaco. It cost him $1.5 million to do that. The embittered, envious socialist in me hopes that his team lost and he had to watch every expensive minute of it. So it's when you hear things like that, and you hear things like that in the papers every day nowadays. 20 years ago you didn't, but nowadays it's like, this is all out in the open, look at what these rich people can do. It's when you hear something like that, you think, and I use this with my wife on a regular basis, and say, why should I feel guilty about not turning the whole light off when this sort of thing happens? Why should I feel guilty about global warming? I've got a choice between 1 or 2 molecules of carbon dioxide escaping or not. I don't know the carbon footprint of moving a satellite, maybe it's not a lot, but the carbon footprint embedded in $1.5 million is probably quite a lot. So I haven't got a lot of time for feeling guilty as a consumer. So anyway, that's at the sort of individual level. We can talk about that more later on. And I just want to move on then now to the political level. What are the options that capitalism is dangling in front of us? A whole array of options that we can choose between to deal with this problem. And just a few of them are put up on this slide. So there's a range of market or regulatory controls and mechanisms being considered or trialled or started in various stages in various parts of the world. They've either arisen voluntarily, that the market has actually just created these things of its own back, or through regulation from governments. So for example, taxations, carbon levies on particular goods and services, subsidies for greener technologies. In the UK recently, energy ratings for fridges in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and for houses just in the last sort of year or so, trying to internalise what has normally been externalised, what the market would want to do, what individual market players, companies would rather, if it's left up to them, keep external. Governments and states are having to force them to try and internalise. And as this change goes on, as the shift goes on from a non-renewable economy to a renewable economy, there's going to be all sorts of changes happening. There's going to be all sorts of winners and losers amongst the capitalist class. Not that we are going to shed any particular tears over that, but you can bet that there's all sorts of infighting. It started already. There's all sorts of battle lines being drawn up. There's all sorts of agreements being signed up. A couple of weeks ago, Sarkozy from France, the Premier, was getting cosy with Gordon Brown. And the reading of that is it's something to do with the nuclear power industry, which France is strong on, and Britain looks like it's also going to be going down that route in terms of climate change and global warming remediation. So there's all sorts of changes going on potentially. This raises big risks for capitalists, but big opportunities as well. I don't want to give the impression, I certainly don't want to give the impression that capitalism cannot be reformed. And maybe I'm probably actually more optimistic that capitalism can change things than Glenn is, perhaps. Capitalism is nothing if not an adaptive, flexible species, as it were. It's shown nimble footwork over the years to keep itself literally in business. So I certainly don't want to give the impression, I would love to stand up here and say, to save the planet you have to join the Socialist Party, this is the only way ahead. I don't think that's the case. Capitalism may well solve this problem. The only thing I would say is that I think it'll take a long time to do it. It'll be, as the phrase goes, a day late and a dollar short. It'll be slow, it'll be cumbersome, it'll be expensive for various reasons. And the main reason being is there's just so much infighting going to be going on within sectors of industry, within nations, and within states. They're at each other's throats. Never mind when you move up to the global level that we'll talk about in a wee minute. But just to touch on the successes, I suppose, of capitalism in dealing with environmental problems, I think it's worth pointing out. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the big environmental issue in Europe was acid rain. UK's emissions from power stations of SO2 affecting the Black Forest and Scandinavia. And that has been sorted out. Similarly, holes in the ozone layer. Now, it may just be that this has been overtaken by events and global warming is grabs the headlines now, but certain indications are that this has stabilised, and the regulatory mechanism that is used to phase out chlorofluorocarbon, CFCs, is actually having some sort of effect. So I think we wouldn't be being realistic if we didn't acknowledge that capitalism can solve some of these problems. But I would probably argue that at the same time I'd say I think these are two quite different things in a way. These are specific pollutants, fairly localised in some sense. It's certainly SO2, fairly localised. Something beeped there, so I'm just going to check. So I'm not sure that these are very good analogies to use, and that we should necessarily place a lot of faith in capitalism's successes. The impact of these regulations were really only felt by a few sectors of industry, whereas in contrast, CO2 emissions, well, these are ubiquitous. It's a ubiquitous byproduct of just about every economic activity you can think of, from agriculture to industry, to transportation, housing, you name it. As I said, as the market shifts, there's going to be winners and losers, as in this cartoon. There's definite opportunities for capitalists there, so there's going to be a lot of infighting. There's an example given by George Monbiot, the environmental journalist, with the carbon levy, CO2 levy that was introduced a few years back in the European Union, where basically they paid the power companies, the utilities, it ended up paying them a certain amount not to emit pollutants. But as it turned out, these were levels of pollutants that they probably weren't going to emit anyway. And the big problem with setting these standards and setting these limits and such like isn't just agreeing how much you're going to reduce it by. One of the big battles is, well, what's your starting point? What's your baseline? So one of the big battles between sectors of industry and between nations, for that matter, is well, where are you starting from? So what happened a few years ago with the utilities is they said, oh, we're putting all this stuff out, we're putting all this CO2 out. But if you give us this amount of money, we'll only put this amount out. But as it happened, they're only ever going to be putting that amount anyway. So they literally cashed in billions and billions of euros for not doing anything. So there's definite winners and losers. How have CO2 emissions changed globally since global warming became a household term? I've got a graph here that I wouldn't want to go all colours into different sort of origins, industrial sectors. The main one's the black one, that's just total CO2 emissions over this timeline at the bottom. And what it shows is that since 1750, 315 billion tonnes of carbon have been emitted to the atmosphere. But crucially, half of that has happened since 1975, around about there. So half of the CO2 that's up in the air, pretty much, or the industrial contribution to it, the anthropogenic contribution, half of that has happened just in the last 30 years. Why has production ramped up over the last 3 or 4 decades, say? Now, again, I don't want to waste too much time on this. Perhaps the best way to illustrate what's happened in capitalist industrial production is to, rather than go into statistics and graphs and such like anymore, is to just offer this commentary from a brand consultant. I don't know either what that means, but he was looking at the glories of free competition, which is of course one of capitalism's strongest defences, that it provides innovation, it encourages and rewards innovation, and where would we be without it? So here's what this brand consultant said regarding the competition over the last 30 years between 2 companies, Gillette and a company called Schick, for domination of the wet shaving market. Now, this is a wee bit of an aside, but hopefully you'll get the point that I'm making here. For 40 years, putting on my brand consultant's voice, for 40 years shaving technology stayed about the same. Then in the 1970s, wet shaving advanced with the creation of the twin blade cartridge. Also in the same year, development on 3 blades started, but it didn't succeed as they caused irritation. In 1998, however, the solution to the problem appeared. The Gillette Mach 3 shaving system from Gillette used 3 blades, the addition of lubricating strips, a flow-through blade design,